She beat a six-time Grand Slam champion without blinking. 9 days later, she stood in front of one man. No crowd, no scoreboard, no line judge, and admitted this was the most nervous she'd ever been. More nervous than center court. Sit with that for a second, because it doesn't make sense yet. And it isn't supposed to. Not until you've seen both rooms. Outside a Nike store in Bonifacio Global City, on the morning of July 13th, a line stretches past the entrance before the doors even open. People start arriving before sunrise, coffee cups in hand, phones already charged to full because everyone knows they'll be filming later. These aren't autograph hunters standing there for a quick photo and a scribbled signature. Nike built this morning around one idea: pull back the curtain on what it actually costs to compete at the top of a sport most fans only ever watch from a couch. A masterclass. Not a meet and greet. Not a transaction. A conversation about pressure, about repetition, about the version of an athlete that never makes it onto a highlight reel. Because highlight reels only show the ball going in. A young woman near the front of the line grips her phone with both hands, like it might slip out of her grip if she doesn't hold on tight enough. Someone a few people behind her says it out loud, for the whole line to hear. "I'm so nervous." Nobody laughs. Nobody even smiles at the confession, because everyone standing there understands exactly what she means. They've all felt some version of it, waiting for someone whose life, until 12 days ago, looked nothing like theirs and now somehow feels like it belongs to the whole country. What that line doesn't know yet, what almost nobody standing there knows yet, is that 12 hours from now, in a different building entirely, standing in front of the single most powerful man in the country, the athlete they are waiting to meet is going to say the exact same 3 words. 2 rooms. One feeling, passed between them like it was scripted. Except nobody scripted it. It just happened, because of what took place 9 days before either room existed. Rewind 9 days, to center court at Wimbledon, the loudest, most unforgiving stage tennis has to offer. Seed 29 across the net from the defending champion, Iga Świątek. 6 Grand Slam titles. A ursum that usually ends matches before they properly begin. On paper, this was a formality. A young underdog gets her moment on the big court, loses professionally in straight sets, and everyone moves on by dinner time. It didn't go that way. The first set alone stretched almost 90 minutes, a tiebreak that refused to end. Both players trading set points like neither one believed the other would actually take it. When it finally broke, it broke her way, 7-6. The second set she didn't need a tiebreak for. She took it clean, 6-2. While Świątek walked back to her chair shaking her head at her own coaching box, unable to explain what had just happened to her. First Filipino singles player in the Open era to reach the round of 16 at a Grand Slam, a national tennis record that had stood, unbroken, for more than 70 years, since the amateur era, since a handful of Filipino men who'd made third-round runs decades before she was born, gone in one single afternoon on the most famous grass court on earth. It's worth pausing on how rare that actually is. Records like that don't usually fall in one afternoon. They erode slowly, get chipped at over a decade by a string of near misses, until one player finally clears the bar everyone else kept brushing against. This one just broke, cleanly, in an afternoon that started like every other second-week Wimbledon match and ended as the most replayed clip of the entire tournament. Here's where most versions of this story rush past the good part. So let's not do that here. World number 140 at the start of 2025. Top 30 by the middle of 2026. That climb isn't one lucky month, and it isn't one lucky draw. It's built from specific, traceable wins, one stacked on top of the next. A title in Birmingham, her first real signal that grass suited her more than anyone, including her own team, had expected. A semi-final run in Berlin, weeks before Wimbledon, against a field that was already testing her at the level she'd need to survive later. Back-to-back wins over Elena Rybakina and Alina Svitolina, both ranked inside the world's top 10, on a surface, grass, that she'd only recently learned to trust with her career. Practice sessions with Venus Williams, weeks out from Wimbledon, training doubles alongside a 5-time champion of that exact tournament, absorbing habits most players only ever read about secondhand in interviews. None of that happened under lights. Practice courts with no crowd, locker rooms with no cameras, recovery sessions, ice baths, stretching routines, none of it filmed, none of it posted, none of it seen by anyone outside a small team that believed in the plan long before the results caught up to it. 110 ranking spots in 18 months is what 2 years of unglamorous repetition looks like once someone finally points a camera at it. It's easy to watch a highlight reel and assume talent alone explains it. It's much harder, and much more accurate, to picture the version of this story where she loses in the first round of a small tournament nobody covers, flies economy to the next city, and does the exact same training block again the following week because that was the only plan there ever was. And it wasn't only Świątek waiting in that draw. A wildcard entry named Serena Williams had briefly made a second-round matchup a real possibility too, one Grand Slam legend after another sitting somewhere on the other side of the net, in a tournament where most 21-year-olds are just hoping to survive the first week without embarrassing themselves in front of a full stadium. 4 days later, in the fourth round, Jasmine Paolini, the previous year's finalist here, stood across the net. 3 sets. 4-6, 6-4, 3-6. Not a collapse. Not a bad day in any conventional sense. A genuinely even match against a genuinely elite opponent, decided by the kind of small margins that don't show up cleanly on a scoreboard. A slightly late split step here. A shot selection there. The fine details that separate the top 20 from everyone still chasing them. By her own account afterward, it came down to a handful of individual points. Not one dramatic turning point anyone could point to and say that's where it fell apart. No villain in that match. Just 2 players at the top of their sport, and on that particular Tuesday, one of them was very slightly better, by the smallest possible margin the sport allows. Consider what it took just to be standing there for a 5th match in a row at a Grand Slam. 5 matches deep is a different kind of tired than anything a practice session prepares a body for. The legs, the shortened recovery windows, the mental toll of having already produced the biggest win of your career 4 days earlier, and needing to somehow reset, refocus, and do it all over again against a different kind of opponent entirely. None of that shows up next to the score. It's just there, underneath it, the whole time, invisible to everyone except the person carrying it. She lost. And that loss, strangely, is the entire reason this story kept moving instead of quietly disappearing into a stats page nobody clicks on. Here's the paradox worth sitting with for a second. A first-round exit at a Grand Slam gets forgotten within a week. A quiet quarterfinal loss barely earns a headline anywhere outside the sport's own press box. But losing in the round of 16, after dethroning the defending champion just to get there, after outlasting a 6-time major winner in a tiebreak, people will still be talking about years from now. That doesn't fade the same way. That gets remembered as the tournament where the entire tennis world found out who she was. The setback didn't shrink the story. The setback is the reason the story kept traveling long after the trophy was handed to someone else entirely. By the time her flight landed back home, the international coverage had already made the decision for everyone watching from outside the sport. ESPN called the win over Świątek a stunner. Sky Sports called it a massive shock. The Athletic folded her breakthrough into its defining storylines of the entire tournament, writing that her performance had pulled her into the wider consciousness of the sport, whether the sport was fully ready for her or not. None of that came from Manila. That's the detail most people skip past without noticing. The Philippine government didn't manufacture this moment out of nothing. The world had already decided it mattered, independently, from newsrooms that had never once mentioned her name before that afternoon, and the country was simply the first institution to formally say so out loud. That's what makes this bigger than one country's back page. Underneath the ranking points, underneath the citation, underneath the flags waved outside a palace gate, this is one of the oldest stories in sport. Someone underestimated for years, finally forcing an entire room to look up and pay attention. Every person watching this from outside the Philippines who has ever been counted out early, overlooked for the obvious favorite, told politely to wait their turn, sees themselves somewhere inside that tiebreak. That's why this traveled as far as it did. That's why it didn't stay a local story confined to one country's sports section. That evening, inside Malacañang Palace, the president didn't open with her ranking. He didn't mention the YTech scoreline once. He spoke about how she carried the win, the composure sitting inside it, not the glory stacked on top of it. That was the deliberate choice. The room wasn't standing up to applaud a result. It was standing up to applaud the way she held herself while achieving it. In front of cameras, in front of opponents, in front of a nation that had never had a moment quite like this one to hold on to before. The room itself does a lot of the work here. A ceremonial hall built for state visits and formal photographs, not for a 21-year-old who was hitting serves on a practice court in relative anonymity a few weeks earlier. Her family sitting close enough to see her hands, if they were shaking. Cameras positioned the way they always are for these things, angled to catch the handshake, the citation, the handoff of a framed document that will end up on a wall somewhere for the rest of her career. Then she spoke. And the same competitor who had stared down a 6-time Grand Slam champion without a flicker of doubt told the entire room, plainly, without polish, that this dinner made her more nervous than center court ever had. She said something quieter after that, something that landed harder than any scoreline could. Hearing it from him, she said, made her feel, for the first time, fully seen, like every hour that never once made it onto a television broadcast had finally been noticed by someone who mattered. Every early morning on an empty court. Every solo rally run back late at night when a match replayed itself in her head and wouldn't let her sleep. Every practice session watched from a plastic chair by someone in her corner, with nobody else around to see it. Then, partway through, she switched to Tagalog. Not a polished translation added for the cameras afterward, a real-time choice, mid-sentence, to make sure nobody sitting in that room needed subtitles to feel what she was saying. The win, she told them, belonged to everyone in it. Together, that is the exact moment this stops being a story about tennis. Because none of this is finished. Not close to it. 12 days after that ceremony, she is expected back on court at the Mubadala DC Open in Washington. A hard court this time. A completely different surface, a fresh draw of opponents, and zero extra rest granted for the fact that a president shook her hand less than 2 weeks earlier. The applause inside that palace does not follow her onto that court. The ranking points do. A player who has already beaten 2 top 10 opponents back-to-back on a surface she barely trusted a year ago is a player with a real, specific case for a first Grand Slam quarterfinal, possibly as early as the next major on the calendar. A player who climbed roughly 110 spots in the rankings in 18 months is a player who could realistically be sitting inside the world's top 20 before this season is over. And it doesn't stop at Washington. Behind that tournament sits an entire second half of the season, hard court swings that will test whether the grass court breakthrough was a genuine level up or a one-surface heater, and every one of those results feeds directly into where she's seated at the next Grand Slam, and the one after that. A player who has already knocked off 2 top 10 opponents on a surface she barely trusted has every reason to believe the next major draw treats her differently than this one did, not as the underdog wearing a lucky number 29, but as a threat team starts scouting for specifically, building game plans around, treating with the caution reserved for players who have already proven they can win the big point on the biggest court available. Somewhere out there is a first Grand Slam final she hasn't played yet. A first time her name sits inside the top 10 instead of chasing it from outside. A first Wimbledon where she isn't the surprise story but the favorite everyone expected to see this deep from the very first round. None of that exists yet. All of it is sitting on the other side of a calendar that doesn't care how nervous she was in a palace 2 weeks earlier, or how many people lined up outside a Nike store to hear her speak. Go back one more time to that morning outside the Nike store. A young woman near the front of the line, gripping her phone with both hands, a stranger a few people behind her, saying it out loud for the whole line to hear, "I'm so nervous," about to meet someone she has only ever watched through a screen. 12 hours later, that someone stood inside a palace and admitted the exact same thing. in almost the exact same words, to the president of her own country, in front of her own family. The girl who didn't blink against a six-time champion still gets nervous. Just never for the reasons you'd expect. Not the scoreboard, not the opponent standing across the net. The one thing that actually shakes her is being fully seen by her own people for every single hour the scoreboard was never built to show them. That's not a weakness sitting inside her. That is the entire story, start to finish, and it isn't finished yet either. Which room got to you more? The line outside the Nike store, or the room inside the palace? Tell me in the comments below. In a few years, when everyone knows this name, you'll want a record of when you knew first.